Lord, we thank you for this night. We thank you for the safety we had traveling here tonight. Thank you for everyone who could make it out here. Just thank you for your word, Lord, that we can study and to learn more about you. And I pray that you will use it in our lives to change us, and to make us into something more usable for you, to be glorifying to you. I pray that you'll just bless our night tonight. In Jesus' name. So, I wanted to have a map because it's kind of hard to picture where all these places are, where he started from. But he starts here at Caesarea, and we're just going to go to Malta, is where he ends up in chapter 27. But so starts in verse 1, says, "And it was determined that we should sail to Italy. They delivered Paul and certain other prisoners, one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustus band, and entering into a ship of Patermedium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there a centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And we sailed, and when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone, and hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto the city of Lycia." So, one thing that I didn't realize was that it sounds like Luke is traveling with Paul in this ship. Luke is writing this, and he uses "we" over and over, and also Aristarchus was also traveling with them, and the centurion is named Julius. So right from the start, there was a problem with the weather from the very beginning that caused them to have to change course. So they went to Fair Havens to try to kind of decide where to go from there. So verse 9 says, "Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said to them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be hurt and much damage, not only of the lading of the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious or comfortable or convenient to weather in, the more part, or the majority, advised to depart thence also, if by any means there might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, that lieth toward the southwest and northwest." So the Day of Atonement was about the end of September, and it was kind of considered unsafe to travel on the Mediterranean from like October to about the middle of March, which is about the time that they were in. They probably left closer to August, but because of the winds and the bad weather, they had left in plenty of time, but they had been quite a ways behind because of the conditions. So it sounds like Paul had won the respect of the centurion because he was kind of allowed to give his opinion on what they should be doing. I mean, he was a prisoner on the ship, but the centurion kind of listened to him. He didn't necessarily take his advice, but he at least listened to one of these prisoners on the ship. And what Paul was saying wasn't like prophecy at that time, but he had plenty of experience on ships, and I think that this time he had been in 3 shipwrecks already, so he kind of was pretty experienced about the weather and sailing. So it sounds like that they didn't, where they were at didn't have much protection from the winter winds, so that they wanted to go from one harbor to another where it was a little bit better to spend the winter, which was a different location on the island, about 33 miles to the east, which would have normally only took a few hours, but they soon realized that they should have listened to Paul's advice and stayed at Fair Havens. Verse 13 to 20 says, "And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon, and when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and were so driven. And we being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, and the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands, the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away." So right after they leave for what was supposed to be a short trip to a different part of the island to stay for the winter, they run into this huge storm, kind of the equivalent of a typhoon or a hurricane, and they were blown off course to Clauda, which is just, you can't hardly even see it on the map, but it's just a tiny island just south of Crete. So the first thing that they did was they tried to haul in the lifeboat or the skiff, this small boat attached to the ship, but they had a hard time, so that must have been filled with water or waterlogged, causing it to be difficult to lift onto the ship. And then they undergirded the ship, which I believe means that they put cables underneath the ship to kind of tie it together to help it not to break apart in these rough seas. So at this point, they had really lost any hopes of making it alive, making it out of there alive. 21 to 26 says, But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told to me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. So, obviously this is kind of one of the low points there. Their despair was beginning to settle in, and Paul was kind of, he says that he wasn't really saying I told you so, but more that he was saying, referring to the good advice that he'd already given to them and telling them that they should listen to his current advice, that there was going to be no loss of life and only the ship, and that they were going to run aground on an island. So, so the message that he had gotten was kind of a reminder for Paul, because it was something that Christ had told him a couple of years earlier when he was in jail in Caesarea, that he must bear witness of him in Rome. And he knew that no storm would prevent that from taking place. So Paul had confidence in God regardless of the circumstances that he was in. So verses 27 to 32 says, But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded, and found it 20 fathoms, and when they had gone a little further, they sounded again, and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern, and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. So this was the 14th night of this storm, and pretty soon after Paul's prediction of that he had just told them, the sailors kind of sensed that they were coming up to land. I don't know if they had heard some breakers or the waves hitting the rocks, or how they knew this, but on Malta, which is about close to 500 miles from Crete, is this tiny little island over here. They have the place where they supposedly landed called Kura, and the breakers there can be heard from some distance even today. So that might have been what alerted the sailors that they were coming close to land. I'm sure that would have been a sound that would have caught their attention, to hear the waves hitting these rocks. So they take their measurements, and they find that the first time was 120 fathoms, and then 20 fathoms, which is 120 feet. And then they may have waited a half an hour and then tried the second time and found that it was 15 fathoms, which is about 90 feet, because a fathom is 6 feet. So based on that, they realized they were coming to an island. They can probably hear it, and it's getting more shallow. So this was at nighttime. It was at midnight, so they put the 4 anchors down to keep them from hitting these rocks at the shore. But the sailors must not have trusted Paul or God, because they tried to leave on their own, deciding that it was probably better chances that they had on this little skiff than to stay with the ship. But Paul realized their true motivation, and they just cut the boat away. It may have been that they needed these sailors because they still had to get to shore. They were still out in the ocean at that time, and if they had left in this boat, that they wouldn't have had any sailors to run the ship there. So it's kind of interesting that the soldiers seem to also be beginning to trust Paul and trust God as well, because they did what Paul said. This prisoner on the ship, they do what he tells them to do and cut this boat away. But, so verse 33, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray that you take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and also took some meat. And we were in the ship, or we were in all in the ship 216 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. So Paul encourages the sailors that they were going to need all the physical strength that they could get to make it to shore. You know, they were going to have to run the ship aground, and they needed some food for some strength, and so they ate. You know, when you think about it, 276 people on this ship, and all that they had been through up to this point, you know, this 14 days of this terrible storm, and then running the ship aground, and not one of them was going to be harmed in any way, is pretty amazing to think about. Because all hope had been lost. I mean, that was towards the beginning of their trip. They didn't have any hope that they were going to make it at that point. So, Paul was a very good example of having a life of faith and wisdom and thankfulness. You know, in the midst of this storm, he still took time to thank God for the food that they had, regardless of their circumstances that they were in at the time. So, verse 39 says, and when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast, and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea to get to land. And the rest, some on board, some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they all escaped, all safe. They escaped, all safe to land. So from what I've read, on Malta, there's a bay called St. Paul's Bay today, which they believe is where Paul landed, which is kind of interesting. But they probably weren't, it says that they weren't, or they didn't know the land, which is probably because that wasn't the main port on Malta, so they may not have been to this bay, so they weren't familiar with it. So they tried to make it to the beach, but the ship ran aground on a sandbar some distance from the shore. The front of the boat stuck in the sand, and the back was exposed to the waves and was being pounded to pieces by the waves. The Romans were usually personally held responsible for their prisoners, and they could, a lot of times they ended up paying with their lives if a prisoner escaped. So they wanted to just kill the prisoners to make sure that that didn't happen in all the confusion of everyone trying to get to shore. But Julius, the centurion, intervened because he wanted to save Paul's life. This kind of reminded me of the story of Jonah, but unlike Jonah, Paul's being on the ship wasn't the reason for the storm, but Paul was the reason that they were delivered from the storm. And God was with them, and because of Paul, all of them ended up being saved. God's hand was clearly in this trip. You know, when you think about it, it may have been that Felix waiting the 2 years was just kind of God's preparation for the trip, you know. I don't know, but he may have had a hand in even making the ship to make sure the ship would hold up during the storm, or maybe even gone back to creation. You know, at creation, he knew he needed a bay there for Paul to go into during his trip. But it's just interesting to think about God's hand in all of this, and his amazing protection of Paul and all the people on the ship that day, and even, you know, with making sure that Julius was the centurion. You know, it's just interesting to think about what God may have had his hand in with this trip that Paul had taken. I kind of wonder what I'm hoping someday when we get to heaven, that we'll be able to see, or to be able to know the different places where God's hand has been in our lives as he's working out his plan for us as well. I'm sure that he probably hasn't created a bay for me to land in at some point, but it's, just to think about the different things through my life, where I've seen God's protection, or the way that he's worked in my life or brought different people into my life. But I'm hoping one day we might be able to know what those things are for our lives, where God's has directed in our lives. Romans 8:28 says, "All things work together for good to them that love God, and to them who are called according to his purpose." I hope and pray that we are able to trust like Paul when the storms of life come to our lives. And whether we know what the purpose of the storms are or not, that we will be able to trust in him. Not for our good, but for God's glory. Because God already knows the storms we will pass through, and it's comforting to know that he is in control. Well, with that, let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, we are thankful that you are a great God, that you are in control, that you are all-knowing, and that you know us better than we know ourselves, that you know the number of hairs on our heads. And I'm thankful that you love us, that you're in control, and I just pray for your direction and guidance in our lives. We're thankful for the times that we don't know about, when you intervene in different areas to guide us and direct us. I'm just thankful for that. I just pray that you will just bless our night tonight, and pray that you will bless our time in prayer, and just have a good time of fellowship. Thank you for hearing our prayers and for answering our prayers. Let's pray that you bless our night in Jesus' name.